Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. Today we have the distinct pleasure of having Greg Grandin on the podcast, professor of history at New York University. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yes, and...
Yeah. I'm starting at Yale
Yes, I was just about to say that.
Okay. I was a liminal position this summer, so I'm not really sure what the correct identification is.
You're on a frontier between jobs, you might say.
The borderlands.
Sounds much more interesting than it likely feels.
Yeah, frontier sounds better than liminal.
But yeah, so Greg's author of a book, Fordlandia, which is very good, but also more recently the book The End of the Frontier, which I've just finished, and very good, very relevant to this to our sort of current moment in time, I would say, and definitely worth checking out. But yeah, we'll just be talking about that in this episode. So welcome, Greg.
Thanks for having me.
I thought, a good place to start would be with the kind of the ideology of the frontier, where that comes from, and what sort of political purpose it served in the early American Republic. You have an interesting sort of dichotomy you set up between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, that dichotomy, I'll get to that dichotomy in a second, but I mean, the ideology of the frontier is expansion, and basically when we're talking about capitalism, whether we're talking about mercantile capitalism or agrarian capitalism, I mean, expansion is built into it, and there's no other country, no other nation that has so embodied that ideal, instantiated that ideal like the United States. I mean, even well before its founding, the whole experience of settled colonialism in the United States was moving west, and that social experience, which took place in an environment of racial conflict, of theological schism, was ideologized fairly early on, and I mean, we could go back. There's really no end to where one could go back to the beginning of, even before the United States was even for the first settlers, Anglo settlers at least, landed in America. The idea of the New World as a place to resolve contradictions and win theological battles and work out problems that were seemingly intractable in Europe was already well established. So just for the sake of the argument, you could just look at some of the founding fathers. They understood that expansion, an ever-growing sphere or ever-growing polity was absolutely essential to the maintenance of Republican virtue. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and I go all through that in the book. And just to jump forward to that schism that you talked about, or that opposition between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, that gets a bit into the story, but John Quincy Adams was the last president, the sixth president of the Coastal Coalition, or the Founders Coalition. And all of those presidents from Washington to Adams had a vision of expansion, but they had a trouble matching theory to desire. There's a lot of things that stood in the way of what they imagined to be an empire of freedom from sea to sea, that without a blot on it, as Thomas Jefferson talked about it.
Right.
Native Americans, chattel slavery, and Mexico. And Andrew Jackson, the first president of the Jacksonian coalition, kind of matched theory to desire and moved forward quite briskly.
No, it's so interesting to read your book, Greg, which I loved and recommending to all my comrades and friends, and to see the link between how myth didn't just kind of organically evolve, but how it was appropriated, as you say, for the political desire and for the power of those elites and others, but how that interacts with the imaginary as well as the political theory, political philosophy developed by Madison. So as you say, the founders were all about expansion, except it had to be, especially with Madison, theorized in a way that ran counter to Montesquieu and ran counter to the ancients and all of the history of political philosophy that shows that large pieces of land are destructive of freedom and republics, right? So that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, there's lots of ways we can enter this, but that opposition, Montesquieu, a French theorist, he represented established Republican thought that believed that you could only maintain Republican virtue in a small polity, because if in a large republic, all of the corruptions of ambition and interest and avarice would eat away at virtue, and Madison's genius was to flip that on its head, and to say that that all of those interests and avarices and ambitions, they didn't stand opposed to Republican virtue. They were Republican virtue. That was the wellspring of private property republicanism,
right,
from which virtue flowed. And the way you maintain it is contra Montesquieu, is actually to, in Madison's word, extend the sphere, and you take in a greater diversity of interest. You dilute the factions. You dilute what later would be called class warfare and all of the political conflicts that emerged from the concentration of wealth in a republic founded on absolute private property.
Right. And my understanding of Madison is he also bought into the diffusion theory that slavery extending to the territories might be okay because you would diffuse the combustion of the antagonism between like the slave power and the slaveholders. And so there was even this solution to such an important issue of domination and power, right?
Yeah. And by the time you get to the 1820s and 1830s, westward expansion was understood as a safety valve to a whole host of very, not just abstractly the way that Madison was theorizing it in Federalist Paper number 10, but to the very real problems of wage labor, of slavery, of what to do with emancipated people of color. So the West was seen as a safety valve. And the point that I make in the book, it doesn't matter what your position was about those problems. You might be an abolitionist. You might be a defender of slavery. You might be somebody who wanted to just ameliorate the slave system and make it a little bit less onerous. But wherever you stood on those crying contradictions of Jacksonian America in the 1920s and 1930s, the solution was expansion. So however you understood the problem and whatever your desired response to the problem, the way that you achieved it was go west, right? And that's the power of the front, of what becomes the ideal of the frontier.
Yeah, this safety valve is exactly what I wanted to bring up next, actually. You draw an interesting contrast between the revolutions in Europe of 1848, where, the kind of working class and the bourgeoisie of all these countries and aristocrats and so on sort of faced off against each other and had these knockdown fights about how they're going to structure their societies. Meanwhile, the United States was invading Mexico and stealing half of its territory. So there's this function, as you say, the safety valve, but it doesn't actually work out quite like people might have hoped, right?
Yeah, that idea of a distinct American 1848 that was the exact opposite of a European 1848, where 1848 was in Europe was the beginning of class politics, was the beginning of labor politics, was the realization that liberalism had to be socialized, leading to, if not social democracy, then at least an awareness of the contradictions in the premise of political equality when confronted with massive industrial and growing inequality and alienation and immiseration. In the United States, you don't have the revolutions of 1848. You don't have the the gentry squaring off against the artisans, on the barricades. You have the gentry and the artisans joining together and waging race war on the frontier. So that has the effect of two things. One, maintaining a very individualistic understanding of liberalism, right? So only what is the essence of American exceptionalism is this kind of commitment to an individualism that even in other countries that were liberal kind of moved away from that absolute liberal individualist absolutism, and then that individual absolutism is inherently racialized because it's forged and maintained and continued through race war on the frontier.
Right. Yeah. And then on the other hand, right, I think historians may agree this. You maybe could correct me on this, but one of the long-term consequences of the war in Mexico was the Civil War, right? In that, it sort of ingested this massive territory, which only ramped up the conflict over whether or not these new territories are going to be slave states and free states.
Yeah.
So,
that's that's like one of the motor paradoxes or contradictions of the argument that I'm making. Right, expansion both defers the problem, but accelerates the problem at the same time, and this manifests itself in real historical events in different ways, and one of them certainly is the Civil War, the movement west. Historians now over the last 10 or 20 years have investigated many different elements of this. The way that Manifest Destiny was seen as both a way to solve the problem of slavery, even as it accelerated and deepened the problem of slavery, turning this moral question into two armed geographic camps, the North and South, in which that competed with each other, that eventually exploded in the Civil War. So it is an example of which expansion allows a deflection of the problem, in this particular case chattel slavery, while at the same time deepening the problem. So the whole machine can only continue operating as long as expansion is an ongoing option, and as soon as it's not, the crash comes pretty quickly.
There's a lot we can learn, it seems, from the history of this myth and how it was appropriated successfully or not by either the reactionary forces or liberals or leftists, it seems. Could you talk first a bit about Turner's thesis, and then maybe we can get to how it gets inverted?
Sure. So the first thing I'd say is that, the word frontier up until the mid-19th century really just meant boundary or border. It didn't kind of signal this existential zone of civilizational creation of individualism. The cognates in other languages, and particularly Spanish, from frontera, it means border or boundary or military front. In the United States, the effect of the Mexican-American War, which kind of disassociates the experience of the border from the frontier. After the Mexican-American War, the U.S. finally gets a border on its south, more or less. There's a Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and then there's the Gadsden Purchase, and so the U.S. gets its border, but the frontier kind of continues. And it's from the mid-19th century onward that the frontier kind of begins to float free as an abstraction and becomes understood in this very exceptionally U.S. way as this place of individualism, and that's where Turner comes in. Frederick Jackson Turner was an historian from Wisconsin. He taught at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And he was a fairly unknown assistant professor when he gave a paper at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893, and the paper was The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And Turner there makes the argument that what is unique and special about the United States, and he breaks from kind of a Boston Brahmin historical profession that looked to Europe as the source of everything good about the United States. Turner says no. What's unique about American equality and American individualism was forged on the frontier, in the wilderness, and this essay functions as both idea, as both social theory. He was a Hegelian. He had read, Marx. He had read a lot of European continental philosophers. Or there's a way in which Turner represents a kind of Americanization of a lot of Hegelian thought, and it was also functioned as ideology. People began to hold up that what was unique about America was the frontier. And why? Let me just say one more thing. Why Turner is important is that he downplays a lot of the racism, explicit racism of the historical profession that held up the Anglo-Saxon blood gene as the originator of everything good about the United States, or Anglo-Saxon blood. Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, the Bancroft historians, the Adams, all historians with the last name Adams, they all tended to be explicitly racist. Turner downplays all of that, and he also downplays the explicit violence of conquest, and he emphasizes things like commerce and trade and community building and trust and laws and technology and this is important because the U.S. is about to launch itself into the world, right? 5 years after he gives this paper in 1893, the U.S. Invades Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and basically establishes itself as the beginning of the world power. And it can't administer the rest of the world as if it were Indian removal writ large, as if it were the Louisiana Purchase writ large, which was explicitly based on a kind of Anglo-Saxon supremacy. So Turner deracinates American settler colonialism. He universalizes it. And the importance of the frontier thesis is that even if you acknowledge that there's violence involved in frontier expansion, in Indian removal, in ethnic cleansing, you could credibly argue that violence and extremism would be left behind as the U.S. moves into the world and moves into the future. It will become more liberal, more international, more universal. So that's the importance of Turner and the frontier thesis. It allows for a whitewashing, if you want to call it that, of the racism of settler colonialism.
You can almost see it presaging liberal or neoliberal free market embrace of or even neoconservative embrace of spreading democracy and the way that kind of expansion. And so maybe we can get to how the frontier moves from just lands to markets to imperialism. But there is at least even a liberal acquiescence or support of this notion that the class struggle and other violence that is so historically real can be argued to be dealt with by pursuing these other frontiers.
Yeah, by expansion. Well, you brought it up earlier about the way the left buys into the notion of expansion, and if an argument can be made, a very depressing argument when one looks back on U.S. history, to almost think that there's almost no usable past, because there is no moment of liberal progress. There is no expansion of the promise of liberal equality to marginalized groups that hasn't been paid for and made possible through expansion. So you start with Andrew Jackson and the expansion of suffrage to illiterate, unpropertied men. That was absolutely dependent on Indian removal and the expansion of the U.S. polity west and the wealth created from Indian removal and genocide and chattel slavery. You look at the abolition and the end of chattel slavery; it was absolutely dependent on the pacification of the West. Right, there was a pact among, different sectors of the Union that basically they'll fight the Civil War, but also the but also concurrently with the past, some of the worst violence against Native Americans took place simultaneously with the freeing of African Americans. The progressive movement in 1898 went hand in hand with the expansion of U.S.'s overseas empire, the War of 1898, and the opening of foreign markets. Even the New Deal, the consolidation of the New Deal was made possible through the opening and of U.S. markets, which allowed for the establishment of a kind of less revanchist corporate bloc that was labor intensive, capital intensive, and wanted FDR to open foreign markets. And then you can go through, certainly the Cold War and civil rights. The U.S. military itself becomes the only real venue in which there's class and race mobility. And what in other countries are distributed as social rights get administered as veterans benefits in the U.S. And there really is no the suffragist movement traded their support for World War I, mainstream suffragists, in support for Wilson's support for the vote. So, we could even talk about Clinton-style globalization and the expansion of rights related to sexual identity and cultural rights. There is no so what do we do with that, right? What do we do with that fact that that the whole premise of the expansion of U.S. liberalism to previously excluded groups has basically only been made possible on the back of the expansion of national power?
Little depressing, you might say. I wanted to reverse course just to circle back to the New Deal era. You have some interesting things to say about the New Deal, as I would say, maybe the only period, that and the sort of post-war settlement, where the sort of foundational the foundation of politics moved towards like being basically class-based, I guess. And FDR has some interesting things to say about the frontier that jar somewhat. It's a contradictory relationship, right? But he doesn't talk about it like Jackson, for example, right?
Yeah, or Turner. Yeah, that was the power of the frontier thesis, is that it contained within itself the terms of its own critique. So if you thought that the frontier created individualism, if you thought individualism was a good thing, then you celebrated. If you thought individualism was something that needed to be contained, then you can use the same basically fundamental analysis, but to critique it. And a lot of the New Deal intellectuals and policymakers, including FDR took Turner transferred from with Madison to Harvard, and FDR took a class with Turner, but apparently he was down sailing. He skipped the semester and went sailing in the Caribbean, but he must have absorbed something, because FDR was brilliant at using the frontier theory to explain the crisis, right? To explain the sources of American wealth, the why in the past, during moments of economic contraction, there was always an exit door or a safety valve. Farmers could pull up stakes and move on, and that prevented the establishment of big government. So he could use the frontier thesis to explain why a government that in the past had regulated very little needed to regulate more. And he was a brilliant communicator, so he could say, but those days are gone. And other New Dealers use the frontier thesis to articulate a kind of new form of social citizenship. They basically affixed the word social to all of these old Turnerian categories. Henry Wallace talked about to tame the social frontier, to tame the social wilderness, social security, social individualism, social rights, social democracy. All of this kind of emerges in the way the New Deal kind of resonated and articulated a new common sense. A lot of it was within a Turnerian framework.
Yeah, it strikes me just now that it's pretty telling that whenever there's some sort of social ill, the instinctive tendency is to declare war on it. War on poverty, war on drugs, war on litter, war on homelessness, as if like we're going to go, man the barricades and shoot homelessness down.
Yeah. There's that, and that has gotten worse as it's been, because in a lot of ways, war, this goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier about Madison's premise, right? That the best way to ensure the diversity of experience and prevent factionalism and extremism is to extend the sphere. But the way that one extended the sphere was through militarism and war. So there was a slight kind of conflation, a quick conflation of expansion as being a condition of freedom to expansion being freedom. And to the degree that expansion was made possible only through militarism was understood as freedom. So yes, there was a way in which the discourse of social problems were in the U.S. and political culture like the U.S. is very susceptible to that kind of militarized rhetoric.
Well, and that's a very interesting point about the conflation, because the conflation works alongside the friend-enemy distinction as long as you don't care that the people that are harmed in that expansion, as long as they're designated the outgroup, not part of the demos, not part of the polis, not part of we, then it is just pure liberation for those that benefit from that domination and expansion and violence, right? So that might play into how Trump and the reactionary right has a long lineage in using the frontier and the myth of the frontier to their advantage, because I hope that we'll get eventually to hope as abysmal as the history has been of how socialism or the left can kind of feed the imaginary in a way that might better serve, right, our whole nation of people, not just those that are designated by the right as counting.
Yeah. I mean, the argument that I make is that Trump turns Turner on his head. It's the way that the border wall has supplanted the frontier as the central icon or symbol of American nationalism, and Trumpism is what happens when an empire ends, when you can no longer vent or roll over the extremism outward. You can no longer, shoot it outward, and it comes back into the heartland. And I link it to the three great closings, right? The end, the exhaustions, the exhaustion of the neoconservative project with Iraq, and the end of that kind of ability to mount these messianic campaigns to chant as a political project of civic renewal. The exhaustion of a neoliberal growth, the growth model that what happened after 2008, and then of course climate collapse. Right, all of these things signal the end of empire or the end of the ability to use the promise of expansion to organize domestic politics, to respond to domestic demands. And so Trump and Trumpism is what happens when that's over, when that ends.
But it's a scary but brilliant insight to say that now borders are everywhere. It's almost like borders are limitless. And so you make this fantastically interesting illustration that, in a way, borders are the new frontier for Trump and Trumpism.
Yeah. Border, it's a way of organizing. Trump's wall is even well before Trump, right? The borderlands began to attract these lost boys of empire, right? Starting around 2000 is when the border militias, the most recent iteration of border vigilantism, took off, but it was circumvented and cut short by 2001. The war, the 9/11, and then Bush's rallying the nation into Afghanistan, Iraq, kind of once again pointed the nation outward. But as those wars started to go wrong, right, as they were revealed to be both a moral and tactical catastrophe, the border movement started anew. So there's almost a direct correlation between, there's a lot of different markers or indicators for the collapse of that neoconservative post 9/11 foreign policy, but certainly Abu Ghraib and those pictures from Abu Ghraib and of U.S. soldiers torturing Iraqis and sexually abusing Iraqi prisoners is certainly as good a marker as any. And the founding of the Minutemen Project, it happened almost exactly as the Abu Ghraib story broke in the press. And from that point forward, 2005, border militia and the border militia movement and the vigilante movement basically began to take over the Republican Party. And they're the ones that, of course, stopped George W. Bush's effort at immigration reform. And then they went on to, to realize themselves in Donald Trump. So what's interesting about that is that most oftentimes these revanchist movements happen after the war is over. Vietnam, in the 1970s, World War I, 1898. I would talk about all of this in the book. We're living in a moment where these kind of revanchist movement is happening as the war is continually going on, right? We're living simultaneously in this endless war, even as the backlash is happening as the war is going on.
Yeah, we can definitely see that, but this process sort of starts with Vietnam, right? As you write in the book, like that was maybe you might say the first major, overseas sort of frontier style war that just backfired spectacularly, and the United States was defeated, right? And the politics of Vietnam just landed in like a hand grenade in the Democratic coalition and sort of stopped the civil rights movement in its tracks, more or less, right?
Yeah, Vietnam and the backlash to Vietnam and Reagan's post-Vietnam restoration, right, is a key part of the story, and his return of the frontier. I mean, there's lots of different kind of time periods that were nested time periods we're talking about, but certainly the end of the New Deal coalition, the Democratic coalition that you talked about, and its unraveling with Vietnam, and then Reagan's restoration of the frontier and the promise of once again overcoming and transcending and moving outward. And as he said, nothing is impossible. There are no limits. And but yoking that to that politics of resentment and backlash that Reagan was good at controlling, but has eventually escaped that control and taken over the Republican Party.
This may be just on a side note here. There's been a bit of discussion about the Sandinistas and Reagan's policy of arming the Contra rebels as well as death squads, the Contras in Nicaragua and death squads in El Salvador and Honduras. Maybe just your quick take on whether he was correct to be opposed to Reagan's Central America foreign policy, and whether that's a problem, as Jonathan Chait said in an article yesterday.
Well, Bernie Sanders. I mean, I wrote a whole other book, Empire's Workshop, about all of this, the role of Central America in the restoration of an imperial presidency, and the way Reagan used Central America to unite movement conservatives and to overcome all of those restrictions placed on the executive branch after Watergate and after Vietnam. And the irony of this, of these reporters going after Bernie Sanders, is that to a large degree, one of the things that the Contra War, I mean, and just on completely moral terms, Sanders, of course, is absolutely correct. The U.S. supported these murderous, rapist, torturers, some of those brutal forces in Central America, death squads in El Salvador that killed 70,000, the Contras in Nicaragua that killed 50,000, that explicitly used terror as a way, as a tactic of war. So Sanders, on absolute moral terms, is absolutely right for being opposed to that. But Reagan's support of the Contra War was also involved a psych ops operation in the United States. One aspect of Iran-Contra that doesn't get talked about is that it created this Office of Public Diplomacy in 1983, running out of the State Department, that Otto Reich was in charge of. And the whole point was to figure out ways to contain journalists and opinion makers that had gone off the reservation with Vietnam, that had become too critical. And they used Nicaragua as a way to re-educate U.S.'s mainstream, punditry class. So, the Office of Public Diplomacy was quite an impressive psych operations. It was staffed by CIA spooks and Department of Defense spooks. It worked hand in hand with Madison Avenue Republican PR firms to figure out how to reframe the debate, what keywords were terrorism, anti-Semitism, all of this stuff. And they planted stories in the press. So, this Jonathan Schott and whoever that reporter was in the New York Times, Sydney or whatever that person was,
Ember, Sydney Ember.
Sydney Ember. They're just products of that restoration. I mean, they are part of a pundit class that was successfully been re-educated by the new right, and part of that re-education, the main instrument of that education was Nicaragua and the Contra War. So the irony of Jonathan Schott criticizing Bernie Sanders for being opposed to Reagan's support of the Contras plays out on multiple levels.
Which reminds me of the Bill Kristol interaction with Bernie Sanders on Twitter, where he calls him quasi-Stalinist, which again shows how much of the right and even liberals like Chait are this pure projection, right? It seems like the re-education takes place on the right, actually.
Yeah, it takes place. It takes place on every level. Bill Kristol went on C-SPAN, went on the news on March 28, 2003, to say that he hoped that what the U.S. achieves in Iraq is what the U.S. achieved in El Salvador. I mean, he explicitly held up El Salvador as an amazing success story. And so the hidden history, the deep history of Central America in the 1980s, not so much for why those particular countries were important, because their importance relied on their unimportance. They were, Central America had no nuclear weapons, they had no natural resources, there were no major superpower that was going to, kick in to defend them. So Reagan could basically give Nicaragua and El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala to movement conservatives to let them run wild, and that's where the project of restoring a kind of ability, imperial presidency, which included ways to bring the press and punditry back on board, took place. And so that's why these things never go away. That's why we have Elliot Abrams. That's why we can't escape these. John Bolton came up through Iran-Contra. I mean, the whole war-making establishment was routed through Iran-Contra, as were these Christian, these right-wing Christian organizations.
Like Ralph Reed and so forth?
Yeah, because liberation theology, I mean, this is getting a little off topic, but liberation theology was the first political religion that motivated the Christian right to get involved in foreign policy before they moved on to political Islam.
Because it was emancipatory, and because it was
within the principles of the Enlightenment. It was humanist, and it was much more of a threat. It was an imminent threat, and
that's right.
Yeah,
I think this is a question I have for you about today, and it seems, spoiler, it's socialism or barbarism, right? But the way the way that the myth of the frontier and the political imaginary or social imaginary relates to how freedom is theorized and which side gets to control how to define freedom seems very important, right? Because in talking about the Minutemen and the border replacing the frontier, you still see the right linking freedom to guns and going and shooting people, and that's seems to be this individualistic, violent form of freedom that the right seems to love. The left, of course, has a different vision of what freedom might mean, and you talk about Eugene Debs, you talk about possibly a socialist frontier myth that might be appropriated, right? Or that historically there were cowboy radicals. How might we think through this contestation today about the frontier myth and how to define freedom?
Well, there are, as you said, there are different ways of defining freedom, and one through line from the Jacksonians forward has been freedom as freedom from restraint, and that's a vision of freedom that's inherently racialized, that's inherently based on domination, that white settlers moved out in the world claiming an ever greater freedom. And it's true, it wasn't just a myth. There was no other people who had as much freedom as white settlers in the United States. And they claimed that freedom by putting down people of color and then defining that freedom as freedom from restraint in opposition to the people that they put down, people of color, African American slaves, Mexicans, Native Americans. So that's an inherently racialized vision of freedom. But there's other understandings of freedom: freedom as obligation, freedom as mutualism, freedom as social responsibility, recognizing one's dependence on others. These are other currents and traditions that have roots in the history of the United States. Now, one of the things that the frontier myth, though, did was that it marginalized what might be called extremism, and it allowed but extremism on both the left, both the right, the white supremacists, but also, kind of property rights threatening extremism or militancy. And it put forward this kind of liberal universalism as the highest form of democracy. And it allowed the U.S. to defer a question or an option that other countries in different ways confronted. And that option was socialism or barbarism. And now that the sphere has been deflated and the frontier is closed and the promise of limitlessness has been negated, the U.S. is, I think, confronting that opposition, and hence we have, the emergence of social democracy, and not just social democracy. Another way of thinking about it is social rights, right? What is exceptional about the United States is its insistence that the only rights that are valid are individual rights, are political rights, rights based on the restraint of the state. Congress shall make no laws. Other countries have balanced those individual rights with the idea of social rights, that the state has to actively act to create virtue. So when Bernie Sanders says that the United States is the only country in the world that doesn't have a right to to health care, it's really a profound critique of American exceptionalism. And what we're seeing now, I think, is the emergence of a generation that believes in the validity of social rights, that thinks it's, and I think that is a major challenge too, and a source of hope.
Yeah. Yeah. As you say, the Trump phenomenon is the racist, revanchist sort of id of the Republican Party breaking loose from any constraints.
And turned inward.
Right, yes. And turning from, brown, waging war on brown people 7,000 miles away to just kind of rounding up any brown people that are sort of handy. The odiousness of that is obvious enough. But another sort of aspect of the situation is there's been just a tremendous backlash to that kind of thinking. As you say, the immigrant camps where, the mass deportation facilities and so on that were President Obama and got worse under Trump suddenly are getting mass media coverage. And I was just looking at this Gallup poll, the percentage of people that say, on the whole, do you think immigration is a good thing or a bad thing for this country today? 2018, about a year ago, good thing was 75%, which was as high as it's ever been since 2001. And so do you think there's Trump's that this politics is sort of just like reaching its sort of like logical endpoint, or is there's still some life left in it?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, politics. I mean, there's, the whether something. I mean, these have to do with very on the ground questions about the ability to mobilize. Even if he has only 30 or 40% support, the ability to mobilize that 30 or 40%, if there's no organized opposition, would mean that there's still life in it. And, I think that Trump, by spectacularizing and turning the brutalism that had long existed on the border and had been bipartisan in many ways into a partisan politics, pageantry of cruelty, has obviously created its opposite and its reaction. And so, so that's a good thing, I think. But whether there's any life in it depends on, I guess, questions of, more in the weeds questions about the Democratic Party and the electoral system and,
right.
And things like that. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
No. So if we think about that side of it, the response that's required, and I mean, because on the one hand, you see how the clear, climate change is becoming something even Republicans are believing in finally, right? So the limitlessness is obviously coming to an end in the minds of almost everyone, and that of course gave rise to the prevalence of borders as one response. On the left, it's difficult because many leftists think in terms of expanding political imagination, and possibilities need to be we can't foresee the end of capitalism. It's easier to imagine the end of the world. How does one think of, as a leftist, pushing the boundaries of imagination of the possible in the context of very real scarcity and very real limits that people are becoming aware of, as they should?
Yeah. So, so there is a temptation to think that Trumpism, or what others might call race realism, which has deep roots in American political tradition in opposition to the idea of a politics of limitlessness and frontier. There's always been a kind of Anglo-Saxon current that has explicitly said, the world has to be organized around lines of dominance. There's not just an open frontier. We've hit, the world is finite, and we have to recognize that finiteness and organize our politics around it. There's a temptation to think Trumpism is a more realistic, albeit cruel, way of thinking about how the world really works, but it's not true, right? Because we've seen that's the lesson of the New Deal. We saw that there are other responses to the reality of scarcity and to the acknowledgement of limits that could be more humane, based on a notion of freedom. Not as freedom as freedom from restraint, but freedom as interdependence and obligation and social responsibility. And there is a tradition within the United States of that. So the point about Trumpism, it's easy to think of Trump's wall as a kind of disenchantment, right? That it's acknowledged. It's a brutal insistence that the conceits of the liberal order that it stands against, that was always based on a falsehood, was always based on the notion that there's not enough to go around, not all boats could be lifted, and Trump and the wall is just a more brutal acknowledgement of that truth. But the point is that the wall is its own enchantment, because what the wall says is that it authorizes this definition of freedom as freedom from restraint, that if we just build the wall, we can continue doing whatever we want. We can continue to burn, we continue to shoot, we continue to, and so freedom from restraint becomes this kind of cultural represented. Cruelty becomes a cultural, a kind of another wedge issue in cultural politics. Who's going to tell us that we can't put kids in jail? Who's going to tell us that we can't burn fossil fuels? So it's its own illusion that everything can continue going on as it had before if we just build the wall. And that's obviously not. That's not.
It's the ultimate fantasy, the ultimate toddler reactance to actual boundaries being set, but now under the guise of responsibility and with guns, right?
Yeah. And it's the way that cruelty just becomes this partisan, culturally represent. Who's going to tell us that we can't torture? Who's going to tell us that we can't kill? Who's going to tell us that we can't issue pardons to war criminals? This is all just different expressions of this definition of freedom as freedom from restraint, which one is not the only. it's not ultimately not viable. Clearly not viable in the long run. So
my concern, Greg, is that this Hobbesian freedom as license and this kind of tyrannical narcissistic thing that has kind of been like a virus spreading throughout the country needs to be met with freedom as you've described, but which, I mean, in other words, is aligned with some vision of the good, right? Which you say involves responsibility and social interdependence and so forth. I wonder though if even social rights, if rights discourse, which seems to be bound up with the law and the state, might be insufficient insofar as it seems to affirm that what the status quo does is kind of enough, and the status quo and the state is kind of the last refuge. Whereas there seems to be the need on the left for perhaps a more radical approach that has both more vision and more agency than what a rights discourse might defer to. What do you think of that?
I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I think that both things are true. I think one, recognizing how radical the discourse of social rights is within the context of the United States and the fetish of individualism and to the degree that individual supremacy, a recognition that individual supremacy is white supremacy, is a pretty radical proposition, and to acknowledge and to work through it and to understand it and understand its historical sources and what we're up against, but. Yeah, I think ultimately you might be very well right, considering how bad things are. That just a move towards social rights isn't enough, considering the the direness of the situation.
I've got as we're close to finishing up here. I have an interesting, just a bit of maybe historical trivia or something that I didn't know about that I think our listeners might be interested in, which was some radical aspects of the Mexican Constitution that were basically annulled by the NAFTA treaty. So can you explain how those worked and what happened to them?
Well, so the logic, just to set it up, and so a lot of the book goes back and forth between the United States and Mexico with the argument that U.S.'s relationship with Mexico is a key element in the foundation of the United States' sense of exceptionalism, and that very brief moment during the New Deal when policymakers overcame that exceptionalism. So the Mexican Constitution in 1917, which came out of the Mexican Revolution, this bloody revolution, which was in many ways the first third world revolution against capital, against the U.S. moved into Mexico after the Civil War and restructured its economy and politics. A nation built, and it promoted export economy that led to the immiseration of millions. And in 1910, there was this massive nationalist revolution that destroyed millions of dollars of U.S. property and nationalized U.S. companies. And the Constitution that was passed in 1917 was the world's first social democratic constitution. It was the first constitution that tried to balance individual rights and social rights, education, healthcare, a right to a dignified life. But it also said that property was a social right created by the state. And this was the foundation of the Mexican Revolution's great land reform. This unbelievable, it's a complicated history, but Mexico distributed an enormous amount of land. It would have been the equivalent as if FDR returned, the Cherokees, their nation, east of the Mississippi. That's basically what the Mexican state did. It distributed and created these collective farms called ejidos, and that was the foundation of the Mexican economic miracle, which lasted for quite a while, but then entered into crisis in the 1970s and 80s. And NAFTA basically was based predicated on Mexico passing laws that watered down its land reform and basically began to reverse it.
Fascinating. With one last question, if you don't mind, Greg, I know you have to go soon, but I don't want to let you go without asking about, since you just talked about NAFTA and we've been talking about Trump, the left discourse on open borders. Both in terms of what that might actually mean in terms of policy, but also in terms of because we've talked about the intersection of political theory and how it's appropriated for political power. How should the left think through the discussion of open borders and whether that is a dangerous term to use, and maybe just talk a bit about your response to all of that.
Yeah, I again, like everything else, I try to answer the question with by thinking through the historical context and what function the border plays. Now, the creation of the U.S.-Mexican border has been central to the establishment of North American capitalism and a form of labor arbitrage that has created multiple hierarchies of wage labor, multiple tiers in a labor hierarchy that has been shifted around over the years as the needs of capital has changed. I don't know what the solution is. There used to be open borders. I mean, the border didn't exist. There was seasonal migration. The militarization of the border has indisputably created the crisis by trapping migrants in the United States who might have previously been seasonal migrants. I tend to think that if capital and commodities have the right to flow freely, then labor should have the right to flow freely. It's the only kind of way one could imagine checks on capital. I know the political limitations of a position like that, but I don't know what other solution there would be other than to move towards some kind of system in which there was a free flow of people across the Americas.
So you support it. Sounds like you support open borders, but would you use the term?
Of course I support open borders. I also support a lot of things that I know that's never going to happen. So.
Unless we make it happen, Greg. Unless we make it happen, we have to. Right? We're the ones that we have to do it. We're the left. Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it.
That's an important point, though. I think insofar as you're talking about how Mexico and a lot of the other Central American countries previously used to have a lot more stable societies before they were blown apart by U.S. meddling. And certainly, I mean, if you're talking about a sort of like a Schengen area from Canada down to Panama or something, that should not just be just like we'll open the southern border and just like suck the entire population of Central America into the U.S. to work, as like domestic servants or whatever. Like, it should also be coupled to a trade regime which allows those societies to stabilize themselves.
Yeah,
right?
The right to stay, right? Not just the right to move, the right to stay, in your home.
We don't, like the refugee crisis is terrible, and we should house just all those people. But it would be better still if they'd never had to leave their homes.
That's a great way to put it
in the first place.
Not just a right to move, but a right not to be displaced, a right not to be moved.
But the profundity of the problem, the drug war, the extraction regime, the history of political violence, the deep histories of political violence and repression.
Inextricable.
Like it's inextricable and hard to, so when people say, well, we need a Marshall Plan or something like that, I mean, that sounds great, but often what that means is just creating more infrastructure for dispossession and extraction rather than a real alternative, to the.
Greg, I feel like what you're saying is imperialism and global capitalism are linked, and what we need to do, the workers of the world need to unite. We need to overthrow capitalism. Is that what you're saying?
Something like that.
I can get on board with that. I'm glad that was the conclusion. I want that to be the conclusion of every episode of Left Anchor, so I'm glad that this one.
Great. Well,
it's been a real pleasure.
Greg Grandin, the book is called... the book is called The End of the Myth, available in bookstores now.
Almost, Ryan.
Definitely check it out.
I think you almost got it right. Greg, you want to give him the actual title?
Well, earlier you said The End of the Frontier, but this time you said it right. The End of the Myth.
Oh, good.
Oh, shit. Sorry.
The End of the Myth from the frontier to the border wall in the mind of America.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and always welcome back.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
everyone. We'll see you next
It was
time.
a great conversation.
Last but not least, we have a friendly reminder that we have a Patreon. You can support the show with $5 a month and get an extra episode every week. We really appreciate the support, and it helps us keep this going.